Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why so much of what we learn about human behavior seems to only apply to a very specific group of people? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating paper that asks a big question. Are we asking the right questions in psychology? The title of this paper is Weird Questions, Diversifying Conceptual Sampling. And what they're talking about with weird is actually a term that has been around for a while. It stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. The researchers here point out that most of the people studied in psychology come from these weird backgrounds. Think about it, most of us who study psychology, or are even participants in studies, often come from these kinds of societies. Now, this has been a known issue for a while, and it is called the weird people problem. Basically, if you only study people from these specific backgrounds, you might be missing out on a huge chunk of what makes humans tick. They found that people from weird populations are actually outliers on many psychological dimensions, meaning they're quite unusual compared to the rest of humanity. For example, the idea of the fundamental attribution error that we tend to blame people's actions on their personality rather than their situation. This seems really obvious to people in Western countries, but in many other cultures, people are more likely to consider the situation or social roles first. But the authors of this paper argue that the problem goes even deeper than just who we study. They also talk about the weird researchers problem. This means that the researchers themselves often come from similar weird backgrounds, and this can create a home field disadvantage, where research starts from a very specific cultural viewpoint and then tries to apply it elsewhere, often without realizing it is biased. This is where they introduce their main idea, the weird questions problem. They argue that even if we start using more diverse participants and have more diverse researchers, if we're still asking the same kinds of questions that grew out of weird societies and their specific concerns, then our science will still be incomplete. They define weird questions as research questions that have historically been shaped by the intuitions, priorities, and perspectives of weird researchers, funding bodies, governments, and policymakers. They start with a simple idea. Scientific questions often come from everyday observations like how gravity makes things fall. But they say in psychology, these common sense observations vary a lot depending on culture, while the laws of physics are pretty much the same everywhere. How people think about things like personality or who they are can be very different. This is the crucial part. They explain that because humans are such a cultural species with incredibly diverse ways of living and adapting, you can't just study one or a few groups and expect to understand everyone. For example, personality tests developed in the US might miss important personality traits that are key in other cultures, what it means to be intelligent or well. Regulated can also look very different depending on where you grow up. They argue that if we want a truly general framework for understanding the human mind for all humans, we need to ask a wider range of questions that come from all sorts of human experiences. So, how do we fix this weird questions problem? The authors suggest a few ways. One is to take theory more seriously. They argue that instead of just following hunches or cultural preconceptions, psychology needs stronger, unifying theories that can guide research questions. They suggest that an overarching meta theory of human psychology, aligned with evolutionary principles, could help us move beyond weird intuitions. Another idea is to do more descriptive ethnographic research. This means spending more time observing and describing what is actually happening in different cultures before coming up with experimental tests. They feel like psychology often skips this important observational step that other sciences build upon. They also suggest rethinking team science. While collaborative research is great, they worry that current big projects often just test if weird ideas work in other places, rather than genuinely exploring new questions from non-weird perspectives. They advocate for generalizing from non-weird populations, not just to them. And then there are structural incentives. This is about how the whole system of academic psychology works. They point out that grants, publications, and job prospects often favor those who ask interesting, weird questions. They believe institutions and funding agencies need to actively encourage and reward the study of weird questions. Finally, they emphasize giving diverse cultural data their due. When researchers from non-weird contexts identify new phenomena, they should be framed within broader theoretical structures, not just dismissed as culturally specific. This helps integrate these findings into the main body of psychological science. To illustrate, they give the example of Ramadan. This is a holy month for about 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide, involving fasting and community. You'd think there'd be tons of psychological research on how this month affects cognitive function, emotions, or prosocial behavior. But the authors found that major psychology journals have virtually zero articles on Ramadan economists, however, have published studies on it. This highlights how certain important topics, even those affecting billions of people, are simply missed because they fall outside the typical weird questions. A really interesting point they make is using language as a rule of thumb for bias in conceptual sampling. If a concept we use in English, like intelligence, has a very different meaning or scope in another language, it is a clue that our English-based definition might be too narrow and weird-centric. For example, a Lua term for intelligence includes social skills and community standing, which isn't typically captured by Western IQ tests. This suggests that some universal concepts we think we understand might be based on our language and culture. Ultimately, the paper concludes that for psychological science to be truly generalizable and to provide a complete picture of human nature, it must diversify its conceptual sampling. It's not just about being fair or ethical, they argue, but about avoiding a straightforward scientific error, including where participants, researchers, and, most importantly, questions is the next step for psychology to understand the full scope of human behavior and help solve global challenges. Now, what is my take on this? I think this paper is incredibly important. The concept of the weird questions problem is a really powerful way to think about the limitations of our current knowledge. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the questions we ask are the only or the most important questions. This research is a great reminder that what is considered obvious or fundamental in one culture might be completely different in another. The authors do a fantastic job of not just identifying the problem, but offering concrete solutions, like focusing on theory and descriptive research. I particularly like the idea of using language translation as a litmus test for bias. It's a practical tool we can all use to question our own assumptions. The Ramadan example is stark and really drives home the point about what we're missing. One limitation, as the authors hint at, is that it is not always easy to identify a truly and non. Where questioned, the lines can get blurry, and what one group considers routine, another might see as a unique phenomenon. And, of course, getting funding and publishing research on less conventional topics can be a battle, as they touch upon with structural incentives. But the potential implications are huge. If psychology can truly embrace diverse questions, it could lead to breakthroughs in understanding everything from global health disparities to cross-cultural conflict resolution, and even how humans might best collaborate with AI. Future research could definitely explore more of these non-weird questions listed in their table, like the concept of kirat or laja, and see how they fit into broader human psychology. This paper is a call to action for all of us to be more curious, to question our assumptions, and to actively seek out new ways of understanding the incredible diversity of the human mind. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a big thumbs up. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the weird questions problem. And don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into fascinating research. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.